Welcome to another deep dive with us. This time, we're going to try to get to the heart of, well, capitalism.
Yeah.
And we're going to be looking at excerpts from Alexander Klein's blog, Klein on Marx.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm excited about this one because Klein, he doesn't pull any punches.
No.
He's got some very strong opinions about how society works, how it should work.
What I like about him is that he doesn't just complain about capitalism. He tries to explain how it works. Like he's giving you a tour of the engine room almost.
And speaking of engines, I got to say, one of the first things that jumped out at me in his writing was this analogy he uses about capitalism as this train that we're all on, built from the blueprints that Marx left behind.
Right.
I mean, is there any getting off this train?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? I think what Klein's saying is that Marx didn't just describe capitalism. He, dissected it.
Yeah.
You know, he showed us the gears and levers, and if we understand those, then we can start to see why some outcomes seem inevitable. We're not just passengers along for the ride. We might be able to see where the tracks are leading.
Okay, but now here's where Klein really throws a curveball.
Yeah.
He claims that exploitation is built into capitalism, even if everyone is playing by the rules.
Right.
I mean, that seems counterintuitive. How can a system be exploitative if everyone's getting what they agreed to?
Well, Klein says that this idea of equivalent exchange, where workers get paid what their labor is worth, that's actually part of the problem.
Okay.
Just because you're paid the market value for your work doesn't mean you're getting a fair share of the value that you create.
Right. And he uses a really great example, I thought.
Yeah.
About how workers are like batteries. You buy a battery for its full price, but you don't expect to pay extra for every bit of light it produces, right?
Yeah, right.
The battery's giving you its all, but the real benefit is the light. And Klein argues that that's kind of how capitalists benefit from the workers' output.
Yeah. It's a striking way to think about it. He's saying exploitation isn't just when someone's being deliberately unfair. It's that capitalism itself has this built-in mechanism for extracting value from workers.
So to put it bluntly, is Klein saying that to be rich in this system, you have to be participating in some degree of exploitation, even if it's unintentional?
That's a question he definitely wants us to wrestle with.
Yeah.
If wealth comes from owning capital, and the value of that capital comes from the work of others, then anyone who's rich is benefiting from a system that might be fundamentally about extracting value from workers.
So even if you don't feel personally mistreated at your job,
right, it
raises questions about where the wealth is really coming from and whether it can really ever be considered earned in an ethical sense. This is heavy stuff, and we're just getting started. But Klein's not just about doom and gloom. He does offer some glimpses of what a world beyond capitalism might look like, and that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah, he does.
So we'll get into that later.
We'll pick up on that next time.
Yeah.
One thing I found really interesting about Klein is how he brings together these ideas from economics and philosophy, even spirituality.
Yeah.
It's like he's trying to show us these hidden connections.
He goes deep, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that phrase he uses about capitalism being an alchemical reactor.
Right.
What do you think he's getting at with that?
Well, I think he's trying to show us how labor gets transformed into value under capitalism. There's this whole process there, this alchemy almost, that we just kind of take for granted.
Right. It's like we've been hypnotized or something.
Yeah.
Like we've just accepted how things work without really asking how the trick is done.
Right. And that's the kind of critical thinking that Klein wants us to do. He wants us to look beyond the surface to see the power dynamics at play, the assumptions that we just take for granted.
So that leads us to one of his, I think, more controversial ideas, this idea of false consciousness. He's basically saying that we're all kind of tricked into supporting a system that's not really in our best interests.
It's not about being tricked by propaganda or something. Right. It's more like we internalize these certain beliefs, certain ways of seeing the world that make the system seem natural and inevitable.
Like the idea that anyone can get rich if they just work hard enough.
Exactly.
Right.
That's a classic one.
That's a classic capitalist narrative.
Yeah.
And Klein's saying that those narratives can blind us to the ways in which the system might actually be rigged against us.
It's about the structural inequalities.
So if we want to move beyond capitalism, we have to start by questioning those narratives, those beliefs.
Right.
And that's That's where philosophy comes in.
That's where philosophy comes in, exactly.
Klein sees that as being a key part of this.
He sees Marx as a philosopher, someone who could see through the illusions of his time and offer a different vision.
And I like how Klein uses historical examples to make his points. Like when he talks about the French Revolution and the banalities of feudalism, it's like he's saying, we might have overthrown one system, but we've just replaced it with another one that's maybe even more insidious. Because it's harder to see.
It's more subtle.
So even our modern system, with all its technology and freedoms, could be just another chapter in this long story of exploitation.
It's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
It's a sobering thought, but it also opens up the possibility that we can go beyond it.
Right. And speaking of alternative systems.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier how Klein sees state capitalism as basically just a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that a little bit?
Well, he's saying that state capitalism, like what we saw in the Soviet Union, it doesn't really solve the problem. It just shifts the ownership of capital from private individuals to the state.
So it can be even more insidious in a way.
It can be, yeah.
Because it uses the language of socialism.
Right.
But the power is still concentrated in the hands of an elite few.
The state bureaucracy in that case.
And so that's why Klein is looking for a path beyond both traditional capitalism and state capitalism.
Yeah.
He wants something that actually empowers people, not just a different set of elites.
Right.
And he talks about, a new kind of currency.
Yeah, the new kind of currency.
That could facilitate that.
Right.
It's a pretty radical concept.
He doesn't fully flesh it out, but he's suggesting that we could have a system where everyone has access to what they need.
Yeah.
And where value is measured differently.
It sounds a bit utopian, I have to say.
It does sound a bit utopian.
But I kind of like the idea.
I think that's part of what makes Klein so interesting.
Yeah.
He's not giving us all the answers. Right. But he's making us think bigger.
Yeah.
He's a provocateur more than a prescriber.
It's like he's taking us to the edge of the map and saying, go explore.
Exactly.
It's a bit daunting.
It is a bit daunting.
But it's also kind of exciting.
It is exciting.
And, speaking of daunting, Klein doesn't shy away from these really complex philosophical ideas.
No, he doesn't.
Like the nature of consciousness, the relationship between individual and collective reality.
He draws a lot on Marx, but he also brings in other thinkers.
Right.
Hegel, Heidegger.
Yeah.
Even the ancient Greeks.
It's like he's trying to create this new framework for understanding the world.
A new synthesis.
That incorporates both material and spiritual dimensions.
Exactly.
He's not content with simple explanations or rigid ideologies.
He's after something more nuanced, more holistic.
And that's where this idea of dialectical thinking comes in. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, it's basically a way of thinking that goes beyond these simple binary oppositions.
Okay.
It embraces paradox, contradiction as part of reality.
So it's about seeing the world not as this collection of fixed categories, but as a process.
As a process, a dynamic process.
So maybe this is a good place to pause right now.
I think so.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
From the inner workings of capitalism to the possibility of something beyond it.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts so far?
Okay, so we've explored Klein's critique of capitalism, gotten a taste of his alternative vision. But what I keep coming back to is how do we put these ideas into action?
Right, yeah.
It's one thing to talk about new paternalism and alternative currencies and all that. Yeah. But what does that look like in real life?
Yeah, does he give us any concrete steps, or is it all kind of pie in the sky?
Right.
Well, he doesn't lay out a step-by-step plan.
But he does give us some hints, I think.
Right.
He talks a lot about the importance of education and ethics,
Okay.
He thinks we need a generation of people who are both critically aware and morally grounded.
So it's not just about changing the system. Right. It's about changing ourselves.
Yeah.
How we think, how we act.
It's like an internal revolution as much as an external one.
But doesn't that risk falling back into some kind of authoritarianism?
That's the dilemma, isn't it?
How do you balance that collective action with individual freedom?
Yeah, and Klein doesn't pretend that it's easy.
Yeah.
He even acknowledges that there might be conflict, violence even.
He brings up some pretty dark historical examples.
Yeah, like the Russian Revolution.
Yeah.
Things can go very wrong, even with the best intentions.
So if we're going to try to build something better, we have to be really aware of those dangers. How do we encourage cooperation without silencing dissent?
It's a huge challenge.
It is. It is.
But it's a challenge worth facing, I think.
Okay, so let's talk about the kind of world Klein wants to build. He says we need to shift away from these materialist values.
Right.
This constant focus on profit and consumption.
Yeah, remember that idea of a new currency?
Yeah.
He's thinking of a system where value isn't just measured in terms of money.
Okay.
With everyone has access to what they need.
But I mean, how would that even work?
Right.
What would motivate people to work, to innovate?
Those are exactly the questions he wants us to ask.
Yeah.
He's not giving us a blueprint.
Right.
But he's pushing us to think beyond the limits of the current system.
And it's not just about these big systemic changes either, is that?
Yeah.
He also talks about the importance of individual choices.
Yeah, even something as simple as washing the dishes.
Right.
He uses that example. He's saying that even those everyday actions can make a difference.
So it's about aligning our actions with our values. It's about taking responsibility for the world we want to create.
Right, one dish, one interaction, one choice at a time.
And that brings us back to ethics,
right?
Which is something that Klein talks about a lot.
Yeah.
He's calling for this more mindful, compassionate way of being. It's almost like a new kind of spiritual practice.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a spiritual dimension to his work.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the world of Alexander Klein.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
And we hope this has, sparked your curiosity, challenged your assumptions.
Made you a little bit uncomfortable, maybe.
Yeah, because sometimes a little discomfort is a good thing.
It means we're growing.
It means we're stretching our minds.
Right.
So we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas.
Yeah, read Klein's work.
Talk about them with your friends. And most importantly, put them into action in your own life.
The future is not something that just happens to us.
Right.
We create it.
Through our choices.
Our actions.
Our commitment to building a better world.
So until next time.
Keep questioning.
Keep exploring.
And keep diving deep